I'm going to get off something today. I did a little bit about the stabbing and politics. I'm going to do something a little different today. What is a place that's supposed to be the symbol of our spiritual guidance, our spiritual lives, everything, was actually the birthplace of something supernatural, ungodly? And I'm not talking about Dracula. No. I'm talking about something far more evil. Something that's very... Holy shit. That's why I don't like talking about shit like this, though. You see what I'm saying? Okay, anyway. Okay. Vatican's lost ritual to control the first vampire king. Yes, I'm talking about the church. The symbol of Christ and everything else. The Vatican. But let's get to the video, and I'll let y'all enjoy the 39 minutes, and I will be out while the video is playing. Have a nice day.
Forbidden texts in a small monastery outside Rome, I stumbled on a reference to something the Vatican itself never meant to see daylight. Rituals designed not to destroy vampires, but to control them. These weren't fairy tales. They were written like instructions, hidden inside marginal notes of Latin manuscripts catalogued as Libri Damnati, the damned books. That phrase alone sent chills down my spine, because it meant the church knew of these rituals, but intentionally suppressed them. The first time I read those lines, the text spoke of Rex Sanguinum, the Blood Kings, figures who appeared in Europe's dark ages, and were treated not merely as monsters, but as rulers of secret kingdoms beneath the earth. The Vatican's own clerics described them as kings cursed by God, but too powerful to kill. Instead, they sought ways to bind them, to force obedience through rituals that combined Christian liturgy with practices taken from much older pagan sources. I found references in the Chronicon Monasteri Cassinensis, around 1100 AD, that spoke of monks carrying iron-bound books into crypts, chanting words they did not dare to record in full. What struck me was the tone. The priests didn't write like they were inventing legends. They wrote like they were terrified witnesses. One account from 1254, preserved in the Vatican's Archivio Segreto, mentions a ritual known as Sacramentum Tenebrarum, the sacrament of darkness. It describes binding a creature whose flesh refuses death and whose eyes glow with the sin of Cain. That reference to Cain wasn't accidental. Early church fathers sometimes associated the descendants of Cain with unholy bloodlines, cursed to walk in darkness. It made me wonder, were these so-called vampire kings linked to that biblical lineage? As I pieced the fragments together, I noticed a disturbing pattern. The church never admitted openly to such practices, but every few centuries, around times of plague or famine, references to the kings below appear again. In 1348, during the Black Death, there are records of papal envoys sent to regions of Transylvania, not only for pastoral care, but carrying sealed reliquaries and texts not to be read aloud. Why send secret liturgies into plague-stricken lands unless something more than disease was being fought? Local folklore still speaks of Domni Intunicats, the Dark Lords, who could not be slain, only appeased by rituals performed by priests. I remember holding one parchment fragment. Its edges burned as if someone tried to erase it from history. It contained only a few words. Et ligabis eos sanguine Christi, and you shall bind them with the blood of Christ. That was not metaphorical. The text suggested the Eucharist itself had been weaponized, not as a sacrament for the faithful, but as a chain to enslave the unholy. Imagine what that means. The very core of Christian worship, the chalice of communion, used as an instrument of control over beings who defied death. I can't shake the sense that these rituals weren't completely lost. Some say fragments still exist in locked vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica, guarded by orders no one speaks of anymore. And if that's true, then the Vatican didn't just fight darkness. It tried to rule it. That realization is why I've never looked at the Eucharist, or the Vatican's silence about its hidden archives, the same way again. It wasn't just faith, it was power. I didn't expect to find the second trail of evidence in such an unlikely place. A dusty archive in Krakow, Poland, where a priest quietly showed me what he called the Lost Chronicles. These were not official Vatican records, but copies smuggled out by monks who feared the knowledge would disappear forever. The chronicles spoke bluntly of battles between church exorcists and kings of the night, who ruled entire valleys in silence, feeding on the people yet worshipped like gods. The priests recorded that Rome never wanted these accounts public because they undermined the image of absolute authority. They revealed that the church was not just shepherding souls, it was bargaining with monsters. One particular chronicle, dated 1422, described a gathering in the Carpathian Mountains. It mentioned a ritual performed by Benedictine monks, led by a mysterious figure called Abbot Laurentius. His notes, written in Latin mixed with Old Hungarian, spoke of using relics dipped in consecrated oil to bind a vampire king to an oath of servitude. The description is chilling. He did not resist, for the chains of the spirit were stronger than steel, yet we knew, should we falter, he would rise and devour us. That line stayed with me. It suggested the ritual wasn't a permanent victory, but a fragile leash. What unsettled me most was how these chronicles linked the vampire kings to politics. One passage stated that the rulers of flesh listened to the rulers of blood. In other words, human kings feared them, and some even submitted. This changes everything. If the Vatican truly used these rituals, it wasn't just a war against darkness. It was also a strategy to keep Europe's fragile monarchies under control. The chronicles claimed that some nobles were forced into agreements where the church mediated between living rulers and these hidden kings of blood. That sounds less like religion and more like spiritual geopolitics. Another chronicle, dated around 1511, described a secret conclave in Avignon, where cardinals debated destroying the manuscripts. One wrote, "Better the world forget, for if these rites fall into the wrong hands, the kings shall not be bound, but freed." Yet somehow, copies survived. Perhaps those monks who defied Rome believed history would one day need to remember. Perhaps they feared that erasing these rituals would mean humanity repeating the same mistakes when the kings of the night rose again. I can still picture the chronicles' illustrations, crude drawings of tall, gaunt figures wearing crowns, their faces partly hidden by hoods, with eyes like burning coals. Below them, monks knelt in prayer, holding crucifixes that glowed with light. The captions didn't call them demons. They called them Reges Antiquae, the ancient kings. This detail is important because it suggests that the church didn't always see them as outsiders. They were recognized as kings, rulers with legitimacy, even if cursed. That makes me wonder, were they once human monarchs who crossed into something darker? The chronicles ended with warnings that chilled me to the core. One line from 1536 said, "The rituals must never be revealed, for in them lies both salvation and ruin. If man forgets, he is free. If man remembers, he is cursed." When I read those words, I understood why the Vatican wanted these texts buried. They weren't just stories. They were confessions. And in those confessions, the church admitted it had stood face to face with kings who were not meant to exist. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the revelations became. The third set of fragments I uncovered dealt not with prayers or relics, but with blood itself. These texts insisted that the true key to controlling the first vampire kings was not fire, not sunlight, but the weaponization of blood, human and sacred. One parchment, preserved in the Biblioteca Laurentiana in Florence and dated to the late 13th century, described a ritual where the blood of martyrs was mixed with consecrated wine. This mixture was not consumed by the faithful, but offered as a binding seal, poured onto the ground while the vampire was forced to kneel before the cross. The language was clinical, almost scientific. Only blood can chain blood, it declared. That phrase echoed through my mind for weeks. It suggests the Church knew that life itself, carried in the veins, was the only element strong enough to bend these creatures. Another manuscript, believed to have been copied from a lost Coptic source, referred to an ancient covenant sealed by the blood of Abel. The implication was staggering. The rituals weren't an invention of medieval Europe, but may have roots stretching back to the earliest biblical murders, when Cain spilled his brother's blood and God cursed his descendants. What frightened me most was how the texts blurred the line between sacred and profane. The Eucharist, the holiest symbol in Christianity, was mentioned repeatedly as a chain, not a blessing. Priests would prepare the chalice not to nourish the faithful, but to force a vampire king into obedience. In some cases, the ritual demanded that the creature taste consecrated blood while oaths were spoken. If it refused, it was said to writhe in agony until submission was achieved. These weren't exorcisms. They were contracts, written in flesh and sealed with blood. The accounts were not without warnings. A document from 1477, attributed to Cardinal Bessarion, stated, "He who commands by blood must guard his own, for the king's hunger for it above all things." That line struck me like lightning. It meant the priests who performed these rites were always in danger of becoming sacrifices themselves. The Church might have believed it was mastering the darkness, but in reality, it was feeding it, sustaining it in secret. I also discovered testimonies from ordinary villagers recorded during inquisitorial trials that strangely echoed these rituals. In Transylvanian villages during the 1500s, peasants accused priests of secretly cutting their own palms during midnight masses, letting drops of blood fall into the chalice. The people believed this was not for God, but for the kings hidden in the mountains. Some witnesses even swore they saw hooded figures escorted into the churches, receiving communion in silence, their faces pale and unnatural. All of this convinced me of one terrible truth. The Vatican was not simply fighting monsters. It was negotiating with them, using blood as currency. And if those rituals still exist somewhere in the locked chambers beneath St. Peter's, then the question isn't whether the vampire kings were real. It's whether they were ever truly defeated, or merely waiting for the right blood to set them free again. I once believed exorcists were only called to deal with possession, the kind we hear about in ordinary church records. But while following the trail of these rituals, I came across mentions of a group that was never spoken of publicly, the Custodes Tenebrarum, guardians of the darkness. These were not the same men sent to cast demons out of peasants. They were trained for one purpose, to confront the kings of blood. In letters hidden in the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, dated around 1291, a cardinal described them as priests who walk in death's shadow, yet hold the cross higher than fear. These were the secret exorcists. The documents suggested their existence spanned centuries. Some reports claimed they lived in isolation, trained in hidden monasteries across the Apennines and the Alps, far from public eyes. A testimony from 1342 in Avignon spoke of a group of 12 men, cloaked in black, who disappeared beneath the catacombs for 40 nights. only to return with their faces pale and eyes hollow, as if they had stared into something no man should see. These men were bound to silence under pain of death, forbidden to record their names, leaving behind only whispers in forgotten manuscripts. I found traces of their rituals described in fragmented manuals. Unlike traditional exorcisms, these ceremonies were not about driving out a spirit. They were about shackling a presence into submission. One manual from the 15th century, written in a code only recently deciphered, gave instructions on drawing circles with consecrated ash, using relics of saints as anchors. The vampire king, once lured inside the circle, would be forced to hear litanies read backward, not to banish it, but to twist its will. The church kept these men hidden because their practices strayed dangerously close to sorcery, though officially they were still servants of God. Rumors persisted that the guardians sometimes failed. A chilling account from 1625 mentions 3 exorcists found drained of blood inside a monastery near Bologna, their bodies untouched by decay. The church declared it a plague death to silence gossip, but the villagers claimed otherwise. They spoke of a tall figure seen leaving the abbey that night, vanishing into the mist. If the records are true, even the best trained priests were never safe against the first kings. The rituals bought time, not victory. Another text, copied during the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, described how the guardians had to be rotated constantly because prolonged service drove them insane. One note read, "He began to see shadows in the daylight and heard prayers spoken by voices not his own. These men carried their burden until death, and their graves were often unmarked to prevent anyone from seeking them out." It was as if the church wanted to erase not just their actions, but their very existence from human memory. If the custodes tenebrarum were real, and I believe they were, then the Vatican had a parallel priesthood hidden in its own heart, one tasked not with saving souls, but with keeping the unholy kings from rising again. And the most terrifying thought of all is this: what if such an order still exists, waiting in silence, trained to resume their forbidden work when the time comes? The next layer of this secret led me to relics I had once seen displayed in churches, never suspecting they had another purpose. Officially, they were fragments of the true cross, drops of blood from saints, or pieces of ancient nails said to have pierced Christ. But in the hidden texts, these were not just relics for veneration. They were tools in a system of control. A document attributed to Pope Innocent VIII in 1487 described certain relics as weapons sanctified in heaven, sharpened for use against the kings of blood. That phrase alone shifted how I saw them. They weren't only symbols of faith, they were instruments. One particular artifact kept appearing in the sources, a chalice said to contain dried traces of a martyr's blood. Locked in the Vatican treasury, I found references to it in the Liber Sanguinis, the Book of Blood, a text reportedly burned during the Inquisition, but preserved in fragments by monks in Spain. The chalice, according to the fragments, was used in midnight rituals where vampire kings were forced to drink from it, their strength broken as the blood inside seared them like fire. The relic was not presented to the faithful. It was hidden because its use was never meant to be seen by ordinary eyes. Another recurring relic was the Lancea Umbrae, or the Spear of Shadows, which some believed was forged from the same iron as the Spear of Longinus. A letter from 1529 claimed it was used in Hungary to pin one of the kings to the ground during a ritual binding. The letter described how the creature screamed as if the heavens themselves had pierced it, and only when the blood touched the relic did it weaken. If true, this suggests relics weren't simply symbolic. They carried an active spiritual force designed for battle. a force deliberately weaponized by the Church. I uncovered testimonies that villages in Eastern Europe sometimes saw processions of monks carrying relics at night, wrapped in cloth, so no one could see what they were. Witnesses described how those relics glowed faintly in the dark, as if reacting to something unseen. The villagers believed the relics were being taken to meet with the lords of the mountains, the kings who ruled from caves and ruined castles. These encounters were never public, but the fact that such rumors persisted for centuries means the people knew something was happening beyond what the Church admitted. The secrecy was so severe that even among clergy, questions about relics were forbidden. One entry in the Acta Sanctorum from the 17th century warns, "Relics must not be misused, nor their secret purpose disclosed, lest the faithful fall into scandal." That line always bothered me. Why would relics cause scandal unless they had been used for something far darker than prayer? When I connected the dots, it became clear. Relics were not just keepsakes of the holy dead. They were chains, anchors, and weapons in the Vatican's struggle to bind what should never have walked the earth. And even now, when I see pilgrims bowing before relics in glass cases, I wonder how many of them know. How many realize that what they venerate was once pressed against the chest of a creature no sword could kill, or placed upon lips that drank the blood of the living? For the Vatican, these relics were never only about faith. They were about control. Control over kings too ancient, too powerful, and too dangerous to be destroyed. The further I went, the more I realized the Church never saw the first vampire kings as simple monsters. They were described as cursed rulers, bound to an ancient lineage that predated even the medieval world. One manuscript, dated to 1243 and preserved in fragments at Monte Cassino, referred to them as Reges Damnati, the damned kings. According to the text, they were once human monarchs who had broken covenants with God, trading their souls for unnatural life. Their curse wasn't random. It was tied directly to rebellion, much like the punishment of Cain. In another text, written in 1317 during the Avignon papacy, a scribe described these kings as descendants of a forgotten dynasty east of Eden. The words were vague, but he connected them to the story of Cain's wandering, suggesting that the bloodline never perished. The kings, in this view, were heirs of a curse stretching back to the world's first murder. That interpretation was shocking because it tied biblical sin directly to the existence of the vampire kings. They weren't foreign invaders in Christian history. They were part of it, hidden in plain sight. By the 15th century, fear of the kings had grown so deep that entire regions were described as under the shadow of their reign. A papal envoy in 1452 reported that peasants in Wallachia would leave offerings at ruined castles, not to honor saints, but to appease the crowned ones who ruled in death. The Vatican's response was not to deny these stories, but to send priests with relics and sealed books. This suggests the Church accepted the reality of the curse, but believed it could be contained rather than destroyed. The curse itself was described in terrifying terms. One account from 1483 claimed that when a king was struck down, his body would not rot, but remain preserved, eyes open, as if watching. Priests wrote that fire could not consume them fully, and burial only delayed their return. Their immortality was not a gift, but a sentence. They could not join the dead, nor could they walk freely in the light. This was their punishment. Eternal dominion in shadows, crowned, but damned. What unsettled me most was the implication that the curse could spread. A monk from Prague, writing in 1501, warned that those who share their blood shall share their throne. It was a cryptic statement, but it hinted that the curse of the kings was hereditary, passed through rituals of blood drinking. This might explain why the church treated them as monarchs, because they truly had dynasties, lineages stretching across centuries. If that is true, then some of those bloodlines may still exist today, hidden among us, masked by history, and the Vatican's silence speaks volumes. If these texts are accurate, then the Church has known for centuries that the first vampire kings were not just legends, but remnants of a biblical curse woven into human history. Their reign was not broken, only veiled, which raises the darkest question of all. What happens if that veil is lifted? What shocked me most while following this trail was how aggressively the Vatican worked to bury any mention of these rituals and the cursed kings. The seventh layer of this story is about silence. Not ordinary silence, but one enforced with fire, exile, and death. A chronicle from 1548 describes how a Dominican friar named Matteo of Verona was executed for doctrines unspeakable. Later notes suggest his real crime was transcribing fragments of a ritual meant to subdue one of the kings. His writings were burned in the piazza, but whispers say copies were hidden by his students, passed hand to hand until they vanished into private collections. The forced silence wasn't limited to rogue friars. Even cardinals risked destruction if they questioned too openly. In the Vatican's own archives, there's a letter from 1611 where a bishop pleaded to preserve one of these texts as a warning for future generations. The reply came cold and final. Better ignorance than temptation. Within months, that bishop's name disappears from the record. It is as if he never existed. The Church didn't want these secrets debated. It wanted them erased. I found evidence that libraries themselves were purged. During the 18th century, when Napoleon's forces looted Rome, several crates of manuscripts vanished from the Vatican's collection. Some were recovered decades later in private estates, but others never resurfaced. Scholars who catalogued them claimed they contained references to rituals of blood and contracts of shadows. The Vatican's official statement was that the missing manuscripts were of no importance. But why lie? Why hide what supposedly didn't matter? The most disturbing testimonies came from common people. In villages across Eastern Europe, stories were told of priests disappearing overnight, their churches boarded up. Local rumor always tied these vanishings to forbidden rituals and to orders sent directly from Rome. One tale from Moravia in 1724 said a priest had been caught giving communion not to his parishioners, but to a hooded figure at midnight. Within days, soldiers arrived, seized the church, and the priest was never seen again. The Vatican called it heresy. The villagers called it silencing. Even today, some researchers who try to dig too deeply into this subject find doors closed. Access to certain Vatican vaults requires special permissions that are almost never granted. A scholar I met in 2017 told me she was denied entry after requesting documents connected to Sacramentum Tenebrarum. The archivist told me, she said, "Some truths are not for this world." That phrase haunted me, because it echoed what earlier bishops had written centuries before. The silence is a strategy. If people never hear these stories, they never ask questions. If the kings are remembered only as folklore, then no one searches for the rituals. No one wonders if they survived. But the persistence of fragments, rumors, and testimonies tells me the opposite. The silence is not proof of absence. It is proof of fear. The Vatican wasn't silencing lies. It was silencing memory. What I didn't expect to uncover was the deep division within the Church itself. The eighth premise revealed a struggle not between the Vatican and outsiders, but inside its own walls. Some leaders argued the vampire kings should be destroyed at all costs, while others believed they could be controlled, even used. A letter from 1463, written by Cardinal della Rovere, warned the Pope that to destroy the kings is to forfeit a weapon given by heaven itself. That word, weapon, changed how I understood their perspective. For certain factions, the kings weren't just a threat. They were an opportunity. The documents show signs of bitter conflict. In the late 1500s, during the height of the Counter-Reformation, debates broke out in secret councils. Some Jesuit reports mention disagreements over the treatment of the reges sanguinis. One account describes arguments so heated that a conclave nearly collapsed. The men pushing for control believed binding the kings could give the church leverage in Europe's endless wars, tipping the balance of power in favor of Rome. Their opponents called it blasphemy, saying no kingdom of God could be built on bargains with cursed rulers. There are hints that the pro-control faction sometimes won. A curious letter from 1632 records the transfer of an unnamed prisoner to Castel Sant'Angelo under papal guard. The wording is vague, but it describes the figure as ancient, pale, yet regal, with eyes of flame. Though the church never admitted to holding such prisoners, but if true, it means at least one of the kings was bound, not destroyed, and kept alive for study, or worse, for use. The opposition, however, never disappeared. In 1712, Archbishop von Hohenberg of Vienna wrote that Rome dallies with shadows, and in so doing becomes shadow itself. His statement was quickly condemned, and within a year, he was stripped of his titles. The official reason was political misconduct, but letters preserved in Austrian archives suggest he had learned too much about rituals still being practiced in secret. His fall was a warning to others. Resist the policy of control, and you risk your life and legacy. What troubled me most was the suggestion that ordinary believers were never meant to know this debate even existed. Publicly, the Church preached purity and divine authority. Privately, it wrestled with whether to enslave evil for its own gain. That duality haunts the Vatican's history, and it raises a terrifying possibility. What if the rituals weren't abandoned because of conscience, but because the factions lost power and were forced underground? When I read these accounts, I felt as though I was peering into a wound that had never healed. The fight over the vampire kings wasn't just about faith. It was about ambition, fear, and control. And in the shadows of the Vatican, where politics and spirituality blurred, the kings became both curse and crown, a temptation too great for men to resist. By the time I reached the 9th premise, I realized the trail of these rituals seemed to vanish almost deliberately. In the early records they appear often, scattered references in chronicles, whispers in letters, fragments of manuals. But after the mid-1700s they almost disappear. A Jesuit archivist in 1769 wrote a note that stuck with me. We are instructed not to preserve the rites, only their memory. That phrase is cryptic, but it suggests the Church made a conscious effort to destroy the rituals themselves while keeping just enough knowledge to remember they once existed. Some historians believe wars and invasions were to blame. Napoleon's sacking of Rome in 1798 scattered countless manuscripts. Yet, when I compared inventories before and after, I noticed something odd. Documents connected to the Sacramentum Tenebrarum were missing even before the French entered Rome. It looks less like accidental loss and more like intentional erasure. The Vatican didn't want